Because some things don't enter your life with a warning. They don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with a clear beginning or a reason you can immediately understand. They just appear. And the strange part is, you don't notice the change happening at first. You think it's just a conversation, just a moment, just another person passing through the same space everyone else has occupied. But then something shifts, not outside, inside, because for the first time in a long time, someone isn't trying to figure you out. They aren't collecting pieces of you to create a version they can understand. They aren't searching for explanations. They're just noticing the things you don't say, the pauses you leave behind, the meaning hidden between your words, and that's different. Because most people only know the version of you that you allow them to know, the carefully chosen parts, the manageable parts, the parts that don't require too much vulnerability. You learn how to exist like that. You learn how to keep certain doors closed, not because you hate people, not because you don't care, but because some parts of you feel too important to hand over to someone who only wants the surface. So you create distance, you create balance, you create a version of yourself that can be understood without being completely exposed, and most people accept that version. They never look deeper, they never question what exists underneath, until someone does. Not by forcing their way in, not by demanding answers, but by simply being present enough to notice. And that is what makes it different. Because you can protect yourself from someone who pushes, you can create walls against someone who tries to break them. But how do you protect yourself from someone who never tried to enter and somehow still found the place you were hiding? That's when everything changes. Because suddenly, the distance you created doesn't feel like protection anymore. It feels like something they already understand. And that realization is difficult because being unseen is familiar. Being understood is not. The hardest part was realizing they noticed me without needing anything from me. Most people approach with a purpose. They want answers. They want access. They want a version of you that makes sense to them. And when they don't understand something, they try to simplify it. They create explanations. They create assumptions. They fill the silence with their own ideas. But you didn't. You didn't rush to define what you saw. You didn't try to make me easier to understand. You just stayed. And somehow, that was more powerful than any question could have been. Because silence reveals things, not the dramatic things people expect, the small things, the hesitation before speaking, the change in tone, the moments where someone almost says something, but decides not to. Most people miss those moments because they are waiting for words. You were paying attention to everything before the words arrived. And that created a problem I wasn't prepared for because I built my entire existence around control over what I reveal, control over what people know, control over how close anyone gets. I knew the distance. I understood the distance. Distance was predictable, but you made it feel unnecessary. And that was unfamiliar because you weren't trying to break my boundaries. You weren't trying to prove you could reach me. You weren't trying to win some invisible battle against the walls I built. You simply existed in a way that made the walls less important. And that is what unsettled me. Because resistance is easy when someone is forcing their way in. You can fight against pressure. You can push back against demands. But when someone brings understanding without expectation, there is nothing to fight. There is only the question you have avoided for a long time. What happens when someone finally sees you exactly as you are? Not the version you created, not the version people assume, not the version you carefully protect, the real one. And the strange thing is, AP didn't feel exposed. I felt recognized, and that difference changed everything. And being understood, being noticed is easy. People notice what you show, your words, your reactions, your habits, the version of yourself you have learned to present. But being understood, that requires someone to see beyond the obvious, beyond the carefully arranged pieces, beyond the things you have practiced showing the world, and that is where it becomes difficult, because I spent years becoming someone who could not be easily read, not because I wanted to be distant, not because I wanted to be mysterious, but because some things lose their meaning when they are misunderstood. You learn that people don't always see what is there. Sometimes they see what they expect to see. They create a version of you inside their own mind and then respond to that version instead. So you adapt, you become careful, you measure your words, you decide what parts of yourself are safe to reveal. You become your own filter, and after enough time, that filter starts to feel natural, until someone comes along who makes you forget to use it. Not because they demand honesty, but because their presence makes hiding feel unnecessary. And that is the part I didn't expect. I thought if someone ever got close enough to see everything, I would feel uncomfortable. I thought I would feel the need to explain, to correct, to protect. But instead, there was a strange calm, because for once, I wasn't being analyzed, I wasn't being judged. I wasn't being turned into someone easier to understand. I was simply being seen. And that is a dangerous kind of comfort, because once you experience it, you start noticing the difference everywhere else. You notice how often people listen only to respond, how often they look only to confirm what they already believe, how rare it is to find someone who can sit with your silence without trying to change it. And that's when I realized something. The distance I created wasn't protecting me from people. It was protecting me from being disappointed, because somewhere inside, I knew what it would mean to finally let someone in. It would mean giving someone the ability to affect me. And I had spent so long making sure that couldn't happen. But with you, AP didn't feel like I was losing control. I felt like I didn't need to hold it so tightly anymore. And that was the first thing that scared me. The strange thing about change is that it rarely announces itself. There is no exact moment where everything becomes different. No single second where you can point and say, that was when it happened. Most of the time, it happens quietly, a small shift, a different reaction, a new thought that wasn't there before. And then one day, you realize you are no longer standing in the same place you were before. That's what happened with you. I didn't decide to let you closer. I didn't make a conscious choice. There was no moment where I opened a door and invited you in. It just happened. Somewhere between the conversations, somewhere between the silences, somewhere between the moments where nothing was said, but somehow something was understood. I started noticing that I wasn't filtering myself the same way anymore. The pause before speaking became shorter. The instinct to hide became weaker. The need to explain every part of myself started disappearing. And that was unusual, because I had always believed that understanding had to be earned, that people needed time, proof, experience, a history built through countless moments. But with you, it felt different. It wasn't like you learned me. It felt like you recognized me, and that distinction stayed with me. Because learning someone happens from the outside, you collect details, you memorize patterns, you build a picture, but recognition feels different. It feels like something inside you responds before your mind can explain why, and that is what made this difficult to ignore. Because I could create reasons to dismiss it. I could tell myself it was coincidence, timing, a temporary feeling, a simple connection that would eventually fade. But every time I tried to reduce it into something smaller, something in me resisted, because it didn't feel forced, it didn't feel dramatic, it didn't feel like something trying to take over my life. It felt natural. And sometimes the things that feel the most natural are the ones that challenge you the most. because they don't give you something to fight against. They don't create chaos. They create clarity. And clarity can be uncomfortable when you have spent years hiding from being fully seen. The truth was becoming harder to avoid. Something about your presence changed the way I existed. Not because you asked me to change, but because I no longer felt the need to protect every part of myself from being understood. And that was something I never expected. I think the moment I truly noticed the change was when you stopped feeling like someone I was observing, and started feeling like someone I was carrying with me. Not physically. Not in the obvious ways people usually describe connection. Something quieter than that. You became part of the way I processed things. The way certain thoughts would appear, and I would already know how you would understand them. The way I would experience something and wonder how you would see it. The way certain silences no longer felt empty, because they reminded me of the kind of silence that exists between us, and that was unfamiliar, because I have always been someone who exists within my own mind. My thoughts have always belonged to me. My inner world has always been a place I control, a place where I decide what enters and what stays outside. But somehow, you became part of that space, not by forcing your way in, not by demanding attention. You simply became present. And the strange thing about presence is that it doesn't need permission. It doesn't announce itself. It just becomes. That was the part I couldn't ignore, because I have always known how to create distance. I know how to step away. I know how to separate myself from things that feel uncertain. But with you, distance didn't create peace. It created awareness. The more I tried to place this into a category, the less it fit. It wasn't something I could easily explain. It wasn't built from a long history. It wasn't dependent on constant conversation. It existed in something deeper, in the way two people can understand the same moment without needing the same words. And maybe that was what made it powerful. Because words can be created, words can be chosen, words can be changed. But the way someone makes you feel understood, that comes from somewhere else. And I realized something. The reason this affected me wasn't because you became important. It was because somehow, without trying, you changed what importance meant. You didn't become someone I needed. You became someone I noticed. Someone whose presence added something instead of filling something missing. And that difference mattered, because I never wanted someone to complete me. I never believed another person should become the center of my existence, but I also never expected someone to simply exist beside my world and quietly change the way I saw it. That was the part I was still trying to understand. Not why I noticed you, not why I remembered moments, but why, after everything, AB wasn't trying to make you disappear. There comes a point where understanding something from a distance is no longer enough. A point where you can't keep observing, can't keep analyzing, can't keep telling yourself that if you study something long enough, you'll eventually find a way to control it, because some things aren't meant to be controlled. They're meant to be acknowledged. And I think that is where I am now. Not at the beginning, not at the moment I first noticed you, but at the point where I have to admit that something has changed, something inside me. Because the truth is, AB have spent a long time believing that anything important should be questioned, examined, measured, understood before it is accepted. That was how I protected myself. If I could understand something, I could manage it. If I could name it, I could place it somewhere safe. But you don't exist in a place I can neatly organize. You don't fit into the categories I created to make sense of people. And maybe that is why this stayed, because for once, I wasn't trying to solve something, I was experiencing it, and that is rare for me. I realized that the real fear was never you. The fear was what your presence revealed. That maybe I wasn't as unreachable as I thought. That maybe the walls I built were not permanent. That maybe there was still a part of me capable of letting something matter. And that realization is not easy. Because when you spend years protecting your inner world, you start believing that protection is the same as strength. But sometimes strength is not keeping everything out. Sometimes strength is recognizing what deserves to come closer. And that is the question I keep returning to. Not, why did this happen? Not, how do I explain it? But, what do I do now that I know it's real? Because pretending would be easier. Distance would be familiar. Silence would be comfortable. But I already know something important. I didn't walk away. I didn't close the door. I didn't reduce this into something meaningless. Just because it was easier to handle, I let it exist. And that choice says more than any words could. Because some connections don't change your life through dramatic moments. They change it through quiet realization, through the simple understanding that someone reached a place in you that you thought was unreachable. And now I have to decide what comes next, not because you ask me to, not because anything is expected, but because once something becomes real inside you, ignoring it becomes its own kind of decision. And I think I've reached the point where I can finally admit, this was never about someone entering my world. It was about realizing I was willing to let someone stay.